Good evening and welcome to another one of our book events. It's an absolute honour to be hosting another one of them. My name is Ben Morehouse. I'm owner of our Bookshop and Tring Book Festival. We've been joined by three brilliant thriller writers. Holly Watt, I'm looking at them on my screen, completely different to everyone else's, I suspect. Holly Watt, Imran Mahmood, and William Shaw. William, who interviewed me previously about a year ago, wasn't it, William?
Yeah, it was back when we thought lockdown was only going to be for a few minutes.
I know. So William runs a podcast, which for one reason or another invited me along to join that. But so the format of today, to the audience who are watching live, is there's a Q&A function along the bottom. Please fill in your questions on there, and I will feed them through to our three authors. And whilst William is sort of in charge from an interviewing perspective, he is also an author. His book, The Trawlerman, is an extraordinary book as well. So, but without further ado, I will hand straight over to William Shaw.
Well, very good evening. I'm not quite sure which of us is in the hottest place, but you know, what a warm day. I hope you're all right and fairly cool at home. I don't think any of the rest of us. Anyway, I'm in awe of the two people I'm with tonight because they've just both had phenomenal careers. And then on top of that, they've both written phenomenally great books. I mean, they've both done, I think, a really good service to crime fiction, which I want to get into tonight, by not writing the obvious crime fiction book. It's a genre which always leads us back into the same space, and it's brilliant when you see writers actually moving out and doing completely new things with the genre. And these two have done something remarkable with both the books we'll be looking at tonight. Holly Watt, we're looking at a third book, The Hunt and the Kill. Investigative journalist at the Sunday Times and the Daily Telegraph, worked for the Washington Post even, Whitehall editor at the Telegraph, on investigative journalist teams, worked on the Panama Papers and the MP's expensive scandals, two of the biggest stories in recent times, but then ran away to Dartmoor to write novels. Her debut won the 2019 CWA Steel Dagger, which is a bit of a 0 to 90 start because that's a very serious prize only given to some of the best writers there are, to the Lions. Anyway, I found this quote of yours, Holly: "Writing was definitely my first love. I spent years of my childhood writing little stories and making up endless adventures. I remember being quite surprised that not everyone did the same thing." Do you know, talk about that, please, because I think that's quite interesting.
I suppose it's just, that's what I do. And I remember putting together little newspapers with little, folded up and stapled. And actually, I do remember, Catherine Faulkner, who's also had a book out recently called Greenwich Park. She works at the Sunday Times now. And another, I think possibly Charlotte Philby, who works at the Independent. We were also chatting on Twitter, and it turned out we'd all sat around making our little miniature newspapers or our little short stories or whatever it was. And I just think, possibly just right from the absolute start, that's just what I wanted to do. And I loved doing it. So it sort of gradually became, and then I went off and became a journalist, which I absolutely adored as well. And people were like, oh, you must have sort of, used your writing skills in journalism. And you do, of course, up to a point. But it's very formulaic news journalism. It's just like paragraph, 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 bang, out goes a story. You don't really have much of your own sort of style in there at all, ever. And so it's very different from actual fiction writing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just being amazed, really. I'd always assumed that everybody made up stories in their head, and realized that people do you find that, Imran, yourself, that actually there's a kind of natural muscle that just seems to make up stories around things, and that's part of what makes you write books?
Actually, for me, not.
I mean, I'm looking for
that. I think for me, I came to the bar when I was 21, so I've been practicing as a barrister since then. And so the stories that I've had to tell are the stories of other people. So someone saying, "Oh, that wasn't me who burned that house. Those might be my fingerprints, but I was just looking in to see if the old lady was okay. And yes, there are fingerprints underneath the sash window, but I had to put my head in to make sure that she was okay when I was talking to her. And yes, and all of it." So those were the stories that I had to kind of run with when I was doing my court work. But before that, I've never really been one for making up stories. And I wasn't really aware that that was a thing that people did until I've got a daughter who's 5 years old, and she does it. She collects these kind of old bits of scrap paper, folds them in half, staples them, and writes stories. And she's just written she's just written a story called "You Are Impossible to Control," right, which is about her 1-year-old sister, because she was in control. And I'm thinking of stealing that.
That's so brilliant. That's fun. You've got a genius in the house. This is I Know What I Saw, which is Imran's second book. Now, Imran is a barrister, as you've said, worked over 25 years. Am I allowed to say that? And pretty much, you know, it bring you in contact with pretty much every walk of life in your legal career. And I suddenly sort of thinking and reading this, yeah, that's a really interesting kind of way to gather, not necessarily, I don't know whether it's the stories, but just certainly the engines that build stories. Born in Liverpool, now living in London. Debut novel, You Don't Know Me, very much like Holly's book, was just picked on as one of these great novels of its time. You know, Guardian Book of the Year, longlisted for Theaksons, nominated for the Glass Bell. Now, Holly ran away to write, so I believe. This is my assumption. You didn't have that. How on earth do you find the time to write and be a barrister?
Oh, well, actually, there isn't really enough time. So what I have to do is, You Don't Know Me, I wrote while I was, in fact, I got the idea while I was writing a speech for a defendant in a murder trial. And as I was writing it, I thought, oh, I'm not really sure that's how he would put it if he was doing the speech. And then I thought, well, I wonder what it would sound like if he was doing the speech. And so then that's how that book is a speech. So there's a jury speech. And it's him saying, oh, these are the things which are important to me, which might be different from what my lawyers would think are the important things. And so kind of told in that way. And so when I started writing that story, that was while I was waiting for a jury to come in with a verdict. And then you spend a lot of time waiting around in court, either waiting to get on or waiting for the next witness or waiting for a juryman who has decided that they that they missed a bus or whatever, and they're going to be 2 hours late. And so I've just used that, or getting the train to Bristol, or getting the train to Leicester. You've got a 2-hour journey where you can write, and so that's what I do. Just try and scavenge wherever I can. But it's hard. It is really, particularly when you've got little ones. And I'm just saying, I feel sorry.
I don't know how you do it when you had little ones. I had to wait till mine were of a certain age before I could even put pen to paper. I should explain to people who haven't read these books what these books are. I'm just going to give a sort of like, Ollie Watt's third novel is really, the scenario is of an investigative journalist. An investigative journalist who's frustrated by not being able to investigate in this particular case, but stumbles on a story that is kind of based about Big Pharma. Can you tell us a little bit about that, Holly?
So basically, my books are about an investigative journalist called Benedict, and she does a lot of undercover work. And in The Hunt and the Kill, she hears about a new antibiotic that could possibly help somebody she's met and gets to know quite well. But for various reasons, she can't get to access it. And it gradually emerges that it's part of the problem is drug dumping, which is something that used to happen in Africa, where in particular, but it happens all over the world, when certain US pharmaceutical companies would take advantage of a tax scheme, basically, and they'd get money back for sending drugs to Africa. It's just complicated to explain. I'm not explaining it terribly well, am I? The one thing you're meant to be able to do as an author is explain your book in a sentence, and yet I can't seem to be doing it tonight. I'm going to blame the heat because I'm going to melt. But yes, it's basically an investigation that takes her across the world and takes into
yeah, it really does. And it is that kind of big power world which we love in thrillers, but seen through a very different light from what we're expected to. I mean, like in some ways it's in the Le Carre tradition, but what's really nice, and I think one of the really original things about this series, is you kind of have a far more real world agency of the people who are involved in the investigation than those kind of cold mail sort of things that always used to be the thing about thrillers. It's a really real world, and you kind of want these people to be your mates, don't you? The people who, which is, I think, really fresh.
Well, I've worked in these three main newsrooms, Guardian, Telegraph, and the Sunday Times, and I really enjoy journalists. They're huge fun. I'm pretty sure barristers are the same. They're kind of bright group of people who quite sort of approach the world in a fairly sort of unusual way, and particularly in the newsroom, that you've just got this incredible sense of energy and enthusiasm and excitement and competition, and quite often like real aggression to get the story first. And you also have these like strange characters in newsrooms. I mean, not picking out anyone in particular, but you have these sort of people who've got these obsessions with this, or, you know, I don't know, you've got the cartoonist over there, or the person who writes the crosswords, or whatever it is. And I really enjoyed that kind of range of people. And I think, yeah, that's what part of the story is about.
It makes me incredibly addictive. Sorry, Imran.
Yeah, I was just going to say there definitely is a similarity between barristers and journalists. And in fact, on Fleet Street, they used to be a pub called the Wig and Pen Club, you may know, which was kind of half journalists and half barristers, and they all come together and swap stories and share stories. And yeah, there's definitely a similarity there, I think, in the kind of people who, you know, turn to one side or the other side of the profession. And quite often it seems like they end up becoming writers as well. I know Erin Kelly, who's a fantastic writer, is also a journalist. And she has spoken in the past about how that has kind of eventually led her to writing the novel. So I think there's definitely something in that, for sure.
And Imran's novel is really, I mean, one of the reasons I've loved reading these back to back is they're kind of opposite ends of the telescope, in that you're looking from the bottom up very much in I Know What I Saw, and the theme of it is very much about the lack of agency people have in power, and this wonderful idea of the impossible crime, the crime that you can't figure out how it happened or how it was observed, related by your main character, who is a homeless person, and therefore nobody believes them, which you must have seen presumably in evidence. But it's an extraordinarily strong narrative point of view to start with, because you're desperate for somebody to believe this character, and yet you start to disbelieve him yourself as the reader, because he's homeless. And we all know homeless people are kind of losers.
Yeah, and that's always the big problem with the criminal justice system when you're going through the machinery of it is, and it's, in a way, it's kind of strange, because the system is designed to deal with people who are right at the fringes of society, and they're disadvantaged, and they're in real kind of tricky situations, either through their own making or through circumstances out of their control. So they're marginalized, or they're in gangs, or they're children, or they're youths, or they've got mental health problems. But the system isn't really designed for them. The system is designed for, the Oxbridge toffs, and the judges and the barristers and everybody else are the ones who are running the system. But the people at the other end of it are the people who have almost, as you say, no agency and no influence in the way that the system operates. And I've always found that really interesting. Whenever I meet clients, there are always those people who are, they're caught up in this kind of net that they can't get out of. And so in the first book, You Don't Know Me, I was dealing with a young black male who was kind of from a part of the world which has deprivation and so on. But in I Know What I Saw, I've got a middle-class, Oxbridge, highly educated, white, middle-aged male. But because of what's brought him to his knees, because when you see him in the book, he's homeless. He's also suffering from that disadvantage. And I thought it would be good to look at it from both ends. And as you say, when your worth in society seems to be measured by the extrinsics, what you look like, or what you do for a living, or how much money you've got. Those are the things that measure our value, but they're not very good measures of value. And I've always thought that there must be a better way of assessing whether somebody is worthy of belief or credible than just looking at what they do, because what they do isn't really a good measure of that.
I want to talk about authenticity a bit, but one of the things that is very authentic in the book is the texture of homelessness. Did you look into that? Did you do any research for that, or is it something you've just picked up because you've obviously dealt with a lot of people from all levels of society?
Well, it started off with me. It started off actually way back when I was 15. I was in Liverpool. I was in a local library. I used to go there, and there was a homeless person who'd come in every day, and he would sit in the science section. And I thought he was warm, and that's why he came in. But over time, I came to realise that he was sitting there reading these very dense academic tomes, and I found that really puzzling, because it was a disconnect for me. And I ended up speaking to him, and he offered to sell me some books, at rock bottom prices. We were in a library. I didn't expect that he was getting, but genuinely, he sold me some books, and I said to him, what's basically what's going on? I found out from my teacher who knew him and had taught him that this guy had been to Cambridge and had been really successful, and he kind of ended up, his journey had taken him to the state of being homeless. And I remember speaking to him and said, look, what happened to you? And he took offense at that question, because he said, nothing's happened to me. This is a choice that I've made, and I've done my own bit for society, and now it's time for you people to do your bit for society. And I found that really difficult to unpack, and I still haven't quite unpacked it, because I don't know whether he was just talking to me, to a 15-year-old and making his life easy because he didn't want the questions, or whether it was a choice. But whether it was a choice or whether it was circumstance, I thought it was interesting to look at homelessness from the perspective of somebody unusual, so that we can get the impression, the true impression, that there's no one archetype of homeless person. It's everyone. You can have a full-time job and be homeless because the system doesn't cater for you. You can't get private accommodation because you can't afford it, particularly in London. The local authority can't house you because you're not priority need, and so you become homeless. And I just thought, let's look at it from his perspective, and then we can all wonder about whether it might happen to us. And I always wonder that.
Good answer there. Imran was talking about the sort of germ in some ways of this thing, and there was a germ with your book as well, wasn't there, Holly? Did you get that?
Well, for all three of them, basically, I written 2 lines of the first road, then the deadline, and then the hunt and the kill, and each one of them was inspired by something that had happened at work. I mean, to the lines, I spent quite a time, refugee camps in, oh dear, my window right.
You're going a bit, it's a bit sounding a bit Dalek-y.
Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, that's working now. I mean, it's just like, I say Holly's in the middle of Dartmoor. If anybody, they have semaphore there, but the internet is still to fully arrive.
Yeah, bless her.
Oh, and now she has actually frozen.
Okay.
We'll chat a bit with Imran, and then we'll because sometimes it comes in waves, and then when it's working best,
Right.
I'll but you at the moment you're frozen as far as from our end.
Same for me. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Just this wonderful thing about want to talk about in your book, Imran, is I don't know how much you plan stuff, but you back the character into this wonderful corner where he's seen something, and not only does nobody believe him, but actually it doesn't appear to be believable what he saw. And as the chapter goes on, it becomes, all the other things. So, well, actually, what you saw can't have happened because the place in which it can't have happened. Did you write yourself into a corner in that, and then try and work your way out, or did you always know what happened in that scene? Because I love it when I'm going like, how could that happen? And of course, I disbelieve everything at that point, and I think this is about an unreliable narrator, and that's quite clever. But sorry, I interrupted.
No, not at all. Yeah, so I'd had the idea for the novel when I went to my agent with the first one, and she reminded me of it. And she said, "Oh, you came with this idea way back then, years ago." And I had decided already to have it as a possible crime, then try and work out a solution, which made sense. And it wasn't easy. And people talk about second book syndrome, and this had a bit of second book syndrome because it was a hard slog to get through it, to be honest.
Was it? Yeah. I mean, I love the fact that actually, and I think this is a universal, that whether you find the book easy to write or hate when you're writing things like that, that seems to be invisible to the reader. It seems to make no difference.
Oh, well, that's a relief if that's true.
Holly, how are you doing? Are you back? You're still looking a bit still. This is
a bit frozen. I'd like to, William, can I bounce a bit of a question back at you? Because I know, you're I mean, this is your Trawlerman is your fourth novel, isn't it? In the series that you're working on at the moment. Give us a quick précis of your of what Trawlerman. It sounds like the scariest book title I can ever imagine. Actually, Trawlerman.
Isn't that funny?
It's very evocative to me.
It's really interesting trying to find titles that scare, isn't it? You know, and I have to say, because the sort of prequel of the series was a book called The Birdwatcher, and the moment I heard, I didn't think of that. It was that C.L. Taylor told me that was what it should be, the writer Carly Taylor, and I thought, what a brilliant word, because suddenly The Birdwatcher sounds really scary, doesn't it? But anyway, the Trawlerman came from, I live in Brighton, and I was a journalist for The Independent as it happened. Well, I was a freelance, and I can remember interviewing people about 24 Hours in the Life of Brighton Beach, and I met this woman, and she was a fishmonger down at the seafront, and she told me that her husband had been lost at sea as a trawlerman, and but also she said, I was actually in love with somebody else at the time, but I couldn't marry him for 7 years because they never found the man's body, and I had no idea about this legal thing. And I thought, what a lovely bit of doubt, because the moment that happens, everybody puts their own stories into, oh yeah, her husband's lost at sea. And so it's about that kind of, you know, one of the themes is about that kind of suspicion that comes in that, which I was just amazed about. So I did actually go out shortly after I talked to you May last year. I spent some time going out with Trawlerman out of Folkestone, because a bit like Holly, who sadly is gone for the moment, I quite like doing some research of that thing. I think it really gives you some interesting wrinkles to the stories.
Yeah, I was going to say, I agree that the research can make that all of the difference in the tone and the quality of the work. And when you've got a really well book like yours, it totally changes the experience.
I had no idea. The tiniest little things just change completely. And we've got Holly back, and she looks like you're there this time. We were talking about research, and I know that for The Hunt and the Kill, you know, you went to Zimbabwe for research. You know, I love this. I love the fact that journalists find another excuse to continue being journalists, but presumably it affected the texture of the book hugely.
Yeah, I mean, I actually went out there because my best friend is a pediatrician specializing in infectious diseases, and she'd been banging on basically about antibiotic resistance. I mean, we were at university together, so we're talking like 20 years of banging on now. And finally I was like, all right, it's quite interesting. And then she was like, well, you know, and she actually went out to live. So she spent time in Sierra Leone while Ebola was, you know, a disaster out there. And then she's been working in Harare, and she was like, come visit me. And I was like, I am 28 weeks pregnant. I'm not getting on a plane, let alone going to Harare. And she was like, no, I really think you should come. I was like, okay. And actually, like, it was, I mean, the hospital that she was working in, I have to say, like, of all the things I've seen in journalism, you know, this hospital was it was really devastating, really. I mean, you've got, because as part of the rest of the research of Hunt and Kill, I went to, well, this was as a journalist, so it wasn't actually planned to be as, you know, a book, but basically, you know, I went to, as a journalist to Public Health England. I went to St George's in Tooting, and saw the neonatal ward there. I went to, I'd visited a friend who was in the Royal Brompton because she suffers from cystic fibrosis, so she spends a lot of time there. And I think the most devastating contrast was between St George's Tooting, the neonatal unit there, where you've got like this, you know, this wall essentially of doctors and nurses who are just so dedicated to keeping these tiny children alive. You know, and one person was like, you know, that when the children are born, sometimes the mothers have to go to one hospital and the children somewhere else, so they're taking photographs of these children, and the problem is the mothers look at the photographs and go, oh look, I mean, that baby looks fine, and so they have to put ballpoint pens into the photograph so that they can see the size of the baby, because otherwise they don't realize how absolutely tiny these babies are. And so, you know, you saw this hospital where, okay, the children and the parents are in this absolutely devastating situation, but everything that can possibly be done to help them is being done. And then the contrast of that in Harare, where there was like a row of beds, you know, each rows and rows of beds with tiny babies in them. Some of the babies are bigger than others, and just like a piece of paper on the end of it with the name and the size of the baby when he or she had been born. But then there was one like separate row off over there, and I was like, well, what about those babies? And they were like, well, they were less than 1 kilogram when they were born, and really like nothing, you know, that they're not going to survive. Even if they did survive, the reality is that they probably have suffered, you know, such problems through the process that they're not going to survive life in Harare, the life in Harare that they're going to face. And I think the absolute worst bit is that the mothers didn't really know that decision had been taken. They were just looking at, you know, they just hadn't realized that, well, they hadn't been told, I'm afraid your babies are not getting anything really to support them. And so I'm not, you know, it was research that I'm really glad I did, but it was incredibly sad to see.
Yeah, no, completely. But it does. I mean, both sort of what we've been talking about really illustrate what I think. You know, I hate to sort of sound that isn't crime fiction fantastic? Aren't we all brilliant? But it's a genre which really does engage with the now in a really extraordinary way. I mean, I think that's one of the real powers. Why, you know, people say, why is it so successful? We all just need a story with an ending. There's a lot more than that going on. And I think, you know, you're both brilliant exemplars of the fact that crime fiction right now is engaging in the world in really interesting ways and telling stories that can only be told now, if you know what I mean. That's not a question.
I found that in lockdown, certainly as a bookseller, the number of customers who are diving into thrillers, you know, and keep in mind I've only run a bookshop since September 19, so I can't give a huge amount of kind of knowledge long term, but people have really sought you know, a sort of escape within the thriller genre, and I think it's been a remarkable kind of period for us. I've had customers sort of consuming the entire back catalogues of every thriller author, and they come back and say, what's next, and so it is
those are good customers to have.
It's definitely
it's a genre that's just sort of booming at the moment, isn't it? And I think it's because you've got different writers coming in and taking a sort of format that was quite sort of, you know, set in its ways and just sort of playing with it and doing, you know, and I think possibly earlier, just before I got brutally cut off by the Dartmoor Wi-Fi, you know, that just, I think there are a lot of women who are writing in the sector at the moment, and the genre at the moment, and again, that's a whole, people coming in with different views on it, and people coming, you know, I think it's incredibly helpful to have had these different lives beforehand, like Imran or like me, or, you know, that people just come in with these different perspectives and run with it.
Yeah, I have to say I agree, and we've got we're living in quite interesting times, I think. So we've moved on from golden age era of crime fiction, you know, which suited the time. And now we're living in a kind of weird post-truth world where, you know, you're never quite sure of where the lines are drawn, and we talk about truth being subjective. You know, people talk about their own personal truths, which was a thing I'd never heard of when I was growing up, and now it's become so commonplace that you can't move for personal truth. Every version of this thing. But the thing that struck me was it's something that we've always kind of been aware of. We've always been aware that, you know, there's no, you know, it's very difficult to get the truth out of people. So sometimes it is nice to sit down and read some crime fiction where you have a bit more control. Somebody has had a bit more control over the ending and the story and the way that it's told. And you can feel safe in the experience of being led from gruesome murder, horrific psychopath, to the eventual conclusion, whatever it is. Even if we're dealing with unreliable narrator, you know that you're going on a journey, I think, and that's, you know, it's a nice place to be.
But if that was the case, we would still be writing golden age fiction, and we're not. And my point is, you're reading fiction that engages in the real world in a way that golden age fiction never did, and that's what I find fascinating. You know, it's Ian Rankin's thing that if I want to find out about a place or a society, I read its crime fiction now. And there's a great book called Detecting the Social, written by some sociologists from all over. But anyway, they're using crime fiction as a stick to beat sociology by saying sociology is no longer doing this stuff of investigating society, but actually writers like you lot are. I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, and I wonder whether that's partly a function of, you know, this era of this psychological thriller, because then instead of dealing with the external world only, we're deep into the internal psyches, which gives writers, I suppose, time to explore what makes us all tick and under the pressures of whatever the pressures are in the modern world, things that people face.
How do you deal? A question has come in. I mean, I mean, you're touching on it here, Imran, with your last comments about the kind of areas you're going into, and there's some pretty dark places you go to. How does that affect you all emotionally? I mean, are you able to differentiate between what you're doing as your day job and then real life? Is it?
I think for me, it's sort of, I mean, at each point, I really got to emphasize that I'm just been there as a journalist. So I've gone and seen these lives, and those people actually living those lives. And, to walk away from that and be like, oh, I've been traumatized by it, it's just ludicrous. But at the same time, I think there was a sort of process of having to sort of think through what I've seen, like going to refugee camps in northern Syria, northern Jordan or Lebanon, or spent a bit of time in Libya, when that was in kind of quite a state of chaos, and it's just, I wasn't traumatized by it, but it was kind of a lot, that you're working hard because you're there to write these stories on deadlines, and you're talking to as many people as possible, and you're seeing as much as possible and doing as much as possible. So it's just a lot to process, and so I think for me, writing is quite often a sort of way of processing that. So it's sort of the opposite of traumatic. It's sort of quite kind of, and I quite often write really, really fast, not as fast as I need to, but still pretty fast. And then I'll read back through it and sort of realize that I've sort of put stuff in there that I hadn't thought before consciously, but had obviously been bubbling away somewhere. So yeah, sort of the opposite of traumatic, I think.
Yeah, and in my job, slightly differently. So over the last 10 years, we've been going at the bar. We've been going through a process of dealing with a lot of historical sex crime, and that's partly because the attitude has changed. So we're now much better at prosecuting historical rape. So even stuff which happened 30, 40 years ago, we're much better at doing it, despite what the press sometimes says about how we're dealing with it. We are dealing with it a lot better than we were, in the pre-Savile era. And so for about the last 8 years, the courts went from doing one case every 2 years, which was a sex case, to now 70% of their work is sex, which is a lot. And I've gone from doing, a case once in 5 years, because it's pretty standard. You do one of those, you do a murder, you do a robbery, and now 60% of the work that we do is that. And there's only so much of it you can do, reading over the alleged abuse of a 5-year-old or 6-year-old, 10-year-old, 15, or even a 30-year-old, day in, day out, without it having some kind of effect. And the profession's just begun to recognize that there's a problem. And now we've got all these wellness programs and all this stuff happening. But I think it's a real thing. But I don't think that we get it as bad as the police officers get it, who deal with the stuff, because I can get away with doing a case and not having to look at some of the, for instance, in an indecent images case, I don't have to look at the images. I can leave that to someone else, but they have to look at the images, and images stay with you. Once you've seen a picture of something, it's hard to get it out of you. It's hard to get an innocent picture out of your head, let alone one which is, something like that. So for me, writing the crime, it doesn't matter how gruesome the criminal stuff is in the novel, because I've got control over the outcome. Because I don't have control over the outcome in the real world. I don't know what's going to happen. In fact, I don't even usually know whether the person did it. Because whether they're found guilty or not guilty, that's all I know, is that is a verdict. If that's become a truth, whether it's true or not. But in the novels, yeah, I can decide whether the person did it or not.
A couple of quick things there. I think if I write something particularly gruesome, I tend to find that I'm surprised at it. And then when I have a reader talk about it, they might be slightly traumatized by it. But actually the process of imagining it is not as traumatic, or reimagining it, if you're doing it in that case, is not as traumatic. And I suspect it's something to do with what Holly said. You're kind of processing it in kind of good way. But my book's actually about a police officer who does have PTSD, which has become quite a trope to write. But I was talking to a a police officer who'd been in that situation. And I think it's becoming very recognized that a lot of people in those emergency services are now quite severely affected. And there's quite a big effort to try and work out how you can keep those people sane and productive. And she had been through counseling for PTSD, and she said it was bloody wonderful. And her positive reaction, she said she learned so much about herself and what she had been involved in through doing that process. And I thought, wouldn't that be nice to write? Because the Trawlerman's actually about kind of the process of recovering from PTSD, and actually not in a negative way, because you always tend to fictionalize it as like, I'm a gruff police officer, I don't want to be given therapy. I actually thought, what happens if the police officer thinks, wow, therapy is teaching me something about myself and it's not bad? And actually, so it's from that sort of thing. So I do think when we create ghoulishness, it's nowhere near as bad for us as it is for the readers.
Yeah, I was contacted by a reader recently who'd read I Know What I Saw, and said that he'd been traumatized by it, but not in the way I'd expected, not by the murder, but by the kind of the stuff I was dealing with in the relationships between, because it's partly a love story in a way, and I was traumatized by that, which I found quite moving, because when you're writing it, as you say, you don't internalize all of that. You're kind of externalizing just right away. But I wonder whether if it can have that effect on somebody else, then maybe you're doing the right thing.
I'd have thought result at that point. I want to talk a little bit more, just get back into the books. We've talked really generally, but one of the things that goes, Casey, you're writing a series, and you have this series character, Casey Benedict, who I really love, because she has real humanity, and she doesn't always do everything right, and she gets anxious about things and things like that. What's not you in her, and what is you? I'm sure I'm not the first to ask that one, but it's kind of what we always want to know about people who write characters of the same sort of background and gender.
It's quite weird. I think, no, not much. I mean, it's their autobiographical elements, but it's definitely not an autobiography. Certainly I've taken bits, because of doing undercover work as a journalist, you kind of find things, you do learn things that are quite specific. I think the classic one for me is that, like, if you've got a camera here and a microphone here, when somebody's saying something interesting, you have to stay still. Because if you move, the camera will rustle, the microphone will rustle, and you'll just black out what is interesting that's being said. And I think that's the sort of thing that you really only know if you've done it and come home and listen, come back to the office and listen to yourself rustling away in excitement. So stuff like that, I think, that's definitely all ripped straight from my career and life. Less so of her emotional dramas and disasters. I think certainly in my 20s I had a slightly more chaotic life than I do now, but still it was nowhere near as challenging as Casey's life.
And Imran, there's a wonderful thing that I haven't brought out. There's this sense of, we have a lot of flashbacks in I Know What I Saw, and they're flashbacks to a really dysfunctional family. They produce these genius boys, but there's a deep sort of darkness in the heart of the sort of whole parenting and things like that. Where did all that come from?
It comes from the experience that I've had in the cases, because the really sad thing is that it feels as though there's always a prior chain reaction, and there's a whole series of events which brings any defendant to a courtroom. And it's usually just about sitting them down and finding out what is the thing which has led you here. And you usually find that it's something in childhood. What's particularly sad is if you're dealing with child sexual offences, you quite often find, it's a kind of cliche, but it turns out to be a true cliche, that some of the abuse is quite often committed by people who have been abused themselves. And it's something to do with the way that it affects the psychology of a person who is young when they're in a developmental state. And that traumatic act changes everything, or can change everything. And I needed to get to the root of the trauma that was underlying Xander in the book. What was the thing which had brought him to his knees in such a dramatic way? And obviously it isn't, everybody experiences a different set of life experiences to bring them to where they are. But in his particular case, it was a story I'd heard before a great deal, and I thought it was a story which, you know, it doesn't always leave the best taste when you deal with that kind of subject matter. But I thought it was a story which hasn't been told enough, needs to be told, or at least, you know, we need to flirt with the idea of telling it in a way which isn't going to put you off. So it comes from it's the experience of meeting clients.
Yeah, but you tell it in a very non-stereotypical way. I mean, you both tell very non-stereotypical stories, which is nice. You're not telling the cliche of that kind of abuse. It's quite a complex family with real complexities. I mean, really, you know, you could, and exactly those sort of families, you might miss it because there's so many other weird things going on in their family, you know. Sorry, which if you haven't read the book, you won't know what I'm on about, but you know, believe me, great. I see, and you both work from professions which are often portrayed in crime and thriller books. And I was just wondering whether you could both reflect on that. Journalists are always bad, Holly, aren't they? In crime, they're always terrible people. Do you find that? Do you get irritated by how journalists are portrayed?
It's the one I felt because Val McDermid. I was reading. I'm going to blank on the name of the book because, again, I haven't slept more than 2 hours in a row for quite some time, thanks to my Amy killed son. But I'm blanking on the name. But there's one thing that she's got this journalist in it who's really awful. And I was like, come on, Val, you used to be one of us. Like, I think it's so kind of, you know, journalists obviously there are plenty of, you know, people who've pushed it all the way through. But I've got a huge affection for journalists. I think kind of A, they're hugely important in our society, and B, they tend to be a lot of fun, to be perfectly honest. And I think I didn't consciously want to reflect that in my book, but I think it came, you know, it's something that's embedded in it, that, yeah, they might be rat bags, but they are quite fun.
No, I think you portray the excitement of a story starting to build and bits coming together. Really, I mean, that's one of the sort of things why you want to read on. You want to be in part of that world. And actually, that's quite a trick these days, making people think they want to be journalists after all the bad press they tend to get.
No, certainly. And it's interesting because it's a profession. I mean, particularly because at the moment, we're vaguely hoping that these books will be turned into a TV series. And it is kind of, we've been talking about like where the best portrayals of journalism are, and there aren't that many actually. I mean, there's some like incredible ones, like Spotlight, for example, is wonderful, but it's quite a difficult world to render in TV in particular, because it's sort of, you want it, it's very easy to be sanctimonious, or, you know, just a bit annoying, or, you know, because of what you're doing as a journalist it's incredibly invasive. It's like, you know, it's going into somebody's life quite often at a point when they're totally traumatized for whatever reason, and asking them really like grim questions, and that's very hard to do that sympathetically, to be perfectly honest. You know, it's particularly, you know, it's just difficult to portray it, but then at the same time it's got to be done for the sort of, for these newspaper stories to appear. So it's a balance that, I mean, certainly a lot of journalists get wrong, and I think it's quite easy to get it wrong.
But presumably, Imran, people get everything wrong when they write about courts.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't know what it is. I think what happens is people sometimes watch something on TV and they'll go, oh, we'll just do it like that, and we won't bother looking it up or speaking to anybody about it, and, you know, to correct it. And the things which get me are things which would probably not get anybody else. Like, I read a book once where the barrister had brown shoes. Now, unless you are a barrister, you probably wouldn't notice that was an awful mistake to make. Like, it's so awful, you may as well have given the barrister, you know, 3 heads and brought him naked into the courtroom.
You'll have to tell me. I've never heard that. This is a whole new thing. Why don't they wear brown shoes?
They just don't. You have it's black shoes. It's cool. You know, it's part of, you know, proper dressing. It's
Imran, can you wear that? Can you wear brown shoes next time? Because you must be doing all this thing on. Can you promise me you'll wear brown shoes on your next virtual court appearance?
Yeah.
So, if you just can't, you won't.
When it's virtual, I tend to have the kind of pajamas and slippers at the bottom half.
You stand for the court.
I heard from Clive Anderson, who you know was a barrister, who used to turn up to court in his jeans because he rode a motorbike, And there was one. He forgot he used to take his trousers with him. He forgot his trousers. Turned up in court with his jeans on, with the rest of his club, a wig and gown, and all the rest of it. And the judge was saying to him, "Mr. Anderson, I can't hear you." And and the temptation is to speak louder when they say, "I can't hear you." But he means he's not allowed to hear your case if you're not you're not properly dressed.
Oh. I mean, the other part, which I think is fascinating, which obviously was a lot to do with your sort of part, political reporting, Whitehall reporting and stuff. Holly, is people like the character Drummond and things like that. There's a sort of really interesting sort of. It's always lovely when politicians are portrayed without the power that they have in a weird way. Do you know what I'm saying? Behind the scenes, there's some lovely sort of scenes in there, and the spads and stuff like that in the book. That must be a real pleasure to write as a journalist, to write the sort of behind the scenes in politics stuff.
It is, and you did get to know quite a lot of them over time, and some of them brilliant and there for the right reasons, and some of them were not brilliant and possibly not there for quite the right reasons. So. But I also found it a fascinating world, and I found, I enjoyed being part of it. So I like including them in my books. But it's also, you start worrying that you're being very cynical and that not everybody is sort of, that you're kind of portraying politicians in the wrong way, particularly as you're an investigative journalist for years, that you kind of be like, oh, I know he's up to no good, I know he's, whatever. And it's not, he wasn't up to no good in particular, but I found it really interesting when David Cameron, the whole thing that sort of erupted recently with Greensill, I was just a bit like, because at the time, you never sort of really got a sense of that. You kind of got a sense that basically he operated in a certain sort of way, but Greensill revealed so clearly, how he acted. And it was just, it was so kind of how, when you read through the text lists and everything else like that, you're just like, that's how he expected life to work. And it's like, it's not possibly illegal, but it just at the same time, it was like, yeah, that's what I thought you were up to. And now finally there it is.
yeah, definitely. So it's lovely to see that kind of thing depicted.
Like he's been caught with his trousers down. Now, William, there's one thing that we need to come clear on. Over the lockdown, you've opened a bookshop. So does that mean there's going to be a new genre in bookshop crime or something coming out?
Yeah, wouldn't that be good? I don't know. I mean, the first thing that I was told by, it's a volunteer, I should explain what it is. It's a 6-month pop-up project. It's called the Bookmakers, and it's in Brighton. I've thought that what I can do, if I open an empty shop, I can invite about 15 writers. They're not all crime writers, but I happen to know quite a few of them who live around the town, because Brighton is thick. It's almost as many seagulls as writers, with writers. And if I invite them into the shop, but say, that if you're coming in, you're going to work with this charity that I also work with called Creative Future, who mentor writers who might have trouble accessing publishing in the same way as middle class blokes like me do. So they've agreed to do mentoring, and in return we sell their books, and hopefully some of them volunteer in the shop. We had Mick Finlay in there today doing a bit of work, lovely writer of Victorian crime fiction, and he was selling books, did rather well actually at selling books. But it's just that space. It's a lovely opportunity to do it. And also, as I, just to sort of blow Ben's trumpet, I think bookshops show such an extraordinary future for towns and cities in the way that other retailers kind of forgotten, because they had to work so hard against Amazon and the destruction of the net book agreement. They had to work out new ways of selling people, and it's all about community, and it's all about, if you don't, everywhere I go, I meet small booksellers, and they know their local they know the head teachers of their local schools. They're embedded in a way that your jeans shop isn't. And I think they show what high streets will become if we let them. So I wanted to do a project on that. Anyway, thanks for asking.
No, that's.
I think Vaseem Khan was. Did he pop along to?
Yeah, Vaseem's there. I called him local because he's a mate, and he promised to come down a lot on the train. And he sold a ton of books when he came down.
The worry is. The worry is that you have.
Well, it's Brighton and South London are intimately connected, I have to say.
So an author comes in, and is there not an embodiment of it, or a huge number of their own books that sell on that day that they're in? Well,
they try not to. I mean, I don't mind if they do, but it's quite interesting. Authors are generous and they're collegiate, and actually, they've generally been better at selling other people's books than their own. But I'm generally in there, and if Vaseem's in there, I just grab everybody and say, "Look, buy a book." We had,
a good egg.
You know, it's easy. It's also really hard to sell your own book, isn't it? You'd know this. It's embarrassing, but it's a lot easier to say, look, Imran, Holly's books, they're brilliant, and they are brilliant. You know, that's the thing we can say because we love other people's books.
I can see Bad Apples there on your shelf. That's a great book by Will Dean. So I'm going to try that.
Very good. Well spotted. Yeah, brilliant writer.
Very friendly as a group, I have to say. They're all, weirdly, but yeah.
No, it's a very good community, but we, you know, and I think it's also it's a very successful place, crime writing. So we don't have to be jealous of each other. Although I'm always jealous of people who write really good books.
But maybe we get our darkness out on the page, and then we say all the good, cozy stuff, the real world.
Yeah, it's also very good for writers to connect. I mean, it must be really terrifying for publishers, mustn't it? You know, we tell each other all this stuff, you know, and I think it's a learning, peer group learning thing. And I think that's quite good, really.
Yeah, I agree.
As a bookshop owner, I didn't, and I've said before that how new I am to the industry, really, but I came in as a community person in the first place. I'm fairly well known within the town, so that I instantly had an advantage in that regard. I've been organising a comedy festival for 10 years now, in preparation for then doing a book festival, which was my in into owning a bookshop. But it's definitely one of those. What I hadn't anticipated was the all-consuming nature of publishing and opening a bookshop. You know, I didn't expect I'd have to work so hard. I think that's the bit that surprised me more than anything else, honestly.
The first thing I was told was, don't think you'll sit down and gently read a book in the bookshop. And this is the first thing I tell volunteers. Although we're very lucky, we're working with Goldsborough Books, David Headley, and he manages the book stock, which is a nightmare job for anybody to have to do.
Well, I expect the best thing about running a bookshop is having Julia Roberts swan in from time.
She does all the time.
And developing a romance.
Yeah.
Well, our travel section isn't quite big enough to inspire her. Yes.
Love Goldsborough, by the way. Also another fantastic bookshop. Beautiful place to be. Even for 20 minutes, if you just step in there and just get a bit surrounded by the peace and beauty of the shop, it's just incredible. I did meet David Headley at the start when I opened it initially. I was hoping that he would come and be part of the book festival, the first festival we ran, and I did find him quite inspiring. We're both from York, so we had something in common, which was quite nice, and he was incredibly friendly. What he's done is extraordinary, really, and obviously progressing down to Brighton as well now.
Yeah, no, it's brilliant. And he's so helpful for us. I mean, it really, because managing the stock is the really hard bit. I mean, it's just, you have to have connections with all those hundreds of people and publishers. But anyway, I want to ask these two writers before we sort of wrap up is, so, Imran, you've written your second book, you're presumably on a third or something. Holly, you're presumably writing your fourth. What have you learnt in the process that you didn't know when you did your first book?
Oh, wow. I don't know. It's got so much, and also having
This is where you can freeze.
I think for me, I wrote to the Lions, and then in my first meeting with my editor, my editor is brilliant. She was like, "Oh, do you think it could be a crime series?" And I think in my head, I had sort of thought, wouldn't it be great because I mean, there's obviously detective series or that sort of thing, but there's not so many journalism-based series at the moment. And so I had sort of thought, well, this is a format that could work because it's plausible that you've got somebody who comes across a crime again and again and solves it. It's a sort of viable format. But I hadn't actually sort of really thought how on earth it would look like a crime series. But of course, when somebody says that to you in a publisher's office, you just go, yes, of course it can be a series. And that's that's how it becomes a series. And then
exactly the same thing happened to me. Is this a series? Yes. Even though I had no idea what books 2 and 3 was.
And I was hugely impressed, people someone like J.K. Rowling, he'd plotted out 7 entire books, whereas I was like, I've written 1, this is amazing, and that it just And I think, you put into Google like how to write your novel and you get literally like a million answers. And you put in how to write your crime series and you get a lot less. And I know that because I literally Googled it and didn't get any responses. So that's been a bit of a crash course, but I've enjoyed it. It's, it's been cool.
Well, it's clearly working. Imran, what do you know now that you wish you'd known setting out on your first book?
Well, I think the thing that I learned more than anything else is how much of a collaboration it is. In my head, before I started, I thought, honestly, without any lie or exaggeration, I thought writing a book involved me writing the book, giving it to the agent who'd give it to the publisher, that they would edit it, because that's why they were called editors, and they would fix it, and then they would sell it. And by then I was long gone. And that obviously isn't what happened. And that was the thing which really surprised me. And I was glad to learn that, it's 1/10 me, it's 1/10 my agent, it's 1/10 my editor, and then probably another editor along the line. And then it's the publicist and the marketing and the book designer and all of these other people. And then, it's the bookshops, all the, the bloggers, every part of that has to work before the book can be a thing on somebody's shelf. Because you can have the book made and it can be published and it can be a book, but if nobody knows about it, it may as well not be a book. So you need every bit of it. And that was the thing I learned more than anything else, that it's not by any means a solo enterprise. Yes, some of it you do alone, but the product itself, is a kind of multi-handed occupation, I think.
It's the weirdest art form in the world. The more I do it, the more I think it is. It's something you do in your head and then you collaborate, but it's also you talk about it being made into the series being made into television, Holly, but we have such a weird privilege because we have to get from our fingers into people's heads, and they make it up after that, don't they? Do you know what I mean? And you spend a year at minimum putting this thing together, whereas a sculptor can work for 3 months and then they can flog it or something. Do you know what I mean? And that's a long thing, but it's such a long haul to get.
Long haul. And the TV is worse. Because I went on to set for You Don't Know Me as they were filming it. And there are, 200 people involved in this thing, making up the sets and doing costume and doing this, all of this stuff that you've heard about. When you go there and you see this, and you see all of these people, hundreds of them, holding cameras and doing scripts.
And you caused this to start. You see, that's amazing, isn't it? What a feeling.
That's a really surreal thing, is that, everybody is looking at you with kind of blame.
You must have felt brilliant, though, presumably seeing it.
I felt very shocked. I walked around pretty shocked the whole time. I'm quite embarrassed that I could, dragged these people to this place to do this kind of frivolous thing that I thought up as a
creating wonderful jobs for them.
Yeah, it was very bizarre. Yeah, it was very, very strange.
Did you do your screenplay? Is that?
And Tom Edge wrote the screenplay. Thank God, because he knows what he's doing. And because he'd done The Crown, he'd done J.K. Rowling's thing. What's it? Galbraith, Cuckoo's Calling, and all those ones. So, and that was I think that was the only reason it got greenlit, was because they'd already known him, and so once he'd said that he was going to do it, I think it was easy. But I was, it's a very, very small minority of things which get lucky, and I was very lucky to have that combination of things. Very fortunate. If it was me, it'd be terrible.
It's such a different art form. It's a different way of telling a story, isn't it? I'm amazed at people. Jo Spain, a colleague of mine on she does both, and I just think, how can you switch from one? Because it's such a different way of telling a story, isn't it?
Well, I'm doing two now at the moment, and it is totally different. You can't, in your novel, you can spend 50 pages developing a scene, like you're setting a background, and on the screen page, it's half a line. And if it's any longer than that, you haven't done it properly. You have to say, walk past pond, there is shopping trolley peeking out, or whatever it is, to give you the entire thing. Whereas that would use up a good 50 pages in my book.
Well, I'm gonna hold up these books again, because you should definitely buy them. We've been talking for at least an hour, and I think we should probably let Ben have his virtual bookshop back. And huge thanks to our bookshop Tring for doing this. A really brilliant speaker, Imran Mahmood and Holly Watt. And I really, it was a real pleasure. I loved both books. Please buy them.
Thank you very much. Sorry about my internet.
Thank you so
It
much.
adds a tension. Tensions. It's the essence of all fiction.
No,
Thank you for having us on. Yeah.
No, massive thanks. And this will be on our YouTube channel. So in a day or two's time, once I've just done a quick edit on it. But no, thank you, all three of you. William, what are you on next? What's your next project?
I have a book coming out next year called Dead Rich, which is a thriller, actually.
Weirdly,
it's a bit of a left turn. I gave it. It's one of those things where you think, oh bloody hell, will they let me change genre and still keep my series going? And I got a yes in the end, which was quite tasty.
Fantastic. And Holly, yourself?
I'm working on the fourth book, which doesn't have a title yet, or ending, or even an ending, to be honest. So it's got a way to go, that one.
Brilliant. And Imran, sounds like you've got your hands full with a load of things.
Yeah. I've just handed in number 3, so I'm waiting for the edits on that. Started number 4, taking a couple of screens. The thing that takes up most of the time are the kids, bloody kids.
Yes.
That takes up most of the time.
Homeschooling.
I feel for you both during that. I don't know how anybody wrote a word over this last 12 months.
Fantastic. Listen, guys, thank you so much for your time. And let's do physical at some point. And we are where we are. And so the world, for those people watching on YouTube, the world officially kind of slightly opened up on Monday. But whether that's real opened up or whether that's just tentative, I don't know. But thank you again. Thank you to the audience for joining us. And we'll see you all very soon.
Bye.
Thank you, guys.